Let's start talking now about responsive design. Let's begin by just looking at a regular web page. So we've got some text in it, and we see we've got the standard lorem ipsum Latin text, and we're just showing that there's some text there. And we can see we have these paragraph tags, and paragraph tags, it does rewrap the text as we change the size of the window. So otherwise we might have to do horizontal scroll. Let's go ahead and add an image. So we've got an image, which is this tomato image. This is a giant tomato. And what we can see here, as we resize our window, we just see less and more of the tomato. So it's not actually changing in size like the text is. A solution to deal with this is we really need to do a couple things. One thing we need to do is add a header, which specifies that we want our viewport to be the width of the window. So as it resizes, our viewport is going to resize rather than being some fixed size. And let's see what difference that makes. It doesn't make much because we haven't actually specified that we want the image to change size. In order for the image to change size, we'd hope we could put something like this. The problem with this is 100% actually specifies 100% of the actual width of that image. And so what we need to do is something slightly different. Let's go ahead and for our image on script, I'll say the max width is 100%. That's 100% of its parent. And the max height is going to be 100% of its parent. Style is the script. So I've added this image and I've specified that its max width and max height is 100%. And that will now give me something that will maintain at 100%. Actually, no more than 100% if I actually go past the size of the image. It won't resize the image to be larger, just to be smaller. And if I go ahead and go into the development console, I can actually see what happens as I make this even smaller. Now, another thing I can do is, let's say I don't want to make it 100%. Let's make it 50%. And let's make it float to the left. And so now what I get is a nice half-side tomato that's half the size of the window. And it's nicely floating. However, if I'm on a small device, that 50% may really make it so I don't get much text over here. It's very hard to read text. It's in a really narrow column. And so if I'm over, let's say, like this, it's hard to read this lorem ipsum dolorsis. So what I'd like to do is have some way of changing the actual layout based on how wide the window is. I want to make some decisions based on how wide it is. And that's really what responsive design means. It means adjusting your layout based on the capabilities of where it's being displayed. What this uses is media queries. So we're going to do a media query. Media query looks like the @media in your CSS. And then you get to specify a layout. So possible layouts are screen reader. And you can imagine you might have a different layout for a screen reader, which is used for accessibility, or print. If you imagine this is going to be a page that's going to be printed, you could lay it out differently. And in this case, we're going to say screen. We're going to specify a selector. There are a number of different selectors. So max width will basically say if the width, and by width here, what we mean is the width of the window that's being displayed, and not the width of the device itself, although that's another selector, but the width of the window itself. If that is no more than 600 pixels, then we're going to go ahead and put in some additional CSS here. And this is applicable only if the width of the window is less than or equal to 600 pixels. I mentioned some of these selectors. So selectors, we've got max width, we've got min width. We can say if it's greater than equal. We have things like, is there a pointing device? Or is the pointing device coarse or fine? Then if you're pointing with your finger, it's a coarse device, right? So you can imagine if you've got, let's say, a checkbox, you wanted to have a larger target for a finger than you would for using a mouse. You also have information on whether hovering is supported or not. So that is, if I move my mouse over something, can I get a tooltip, for example? You can look at screen ratio, information about colors, sorts of things like that. But the most commonly used ones are the max width and the max height. So what are we going to do in this case? Let's go ahead and take the image and make some modifications if we're on a smaller device. We're not going to go ahead and float. And we're going to make our max width and height be larger. So let's go take a look at that. So what we see is that now all of a sudden we're on top of the text instead of below it. And it continues to do that. The tomato gets bigger and bigger and bigger till we get to more than 600. And then all of a sudden reverts to the CSS used without the selector. So this works as well, just in a regular window like this. And if we were, let's say, on a phone screen, this might be the size of a phone screen. In fact, let's go look again at sizes of phone screens. So let's say we had a Moto G4. It's going to look like that. If we have an iPhone 10, it's going to look like that, and so on. On the other hand, if we have an iPad, it's going to have a much larger window. It's going to be like this. So that is an example of responsive design, and it can be done just with CSS, as we've seen. You can add multiple media queries. You might have a set of different layouts that you use. So you might have one set of CSS that you're going to use if you're less than, let's say, 400 pixels, and another one less than 600 pixels, another less than 1,000 pixels. These numbers are commonly chosen based on the standard sizes of particular phones and tablets. So if we added, for example, another here, so let's say we had a max width. Let's just make this one 800, and we made this one be 80%. And we'll go ahead, and I'm not sure what practical reason we have for floating on the right, but let's say we float on the right. Let's go ahead and make this responsive again. And so we can see we're not floating 100%. We're floating on the left 50%. All right, actually, let's look at what the problem was here. So the problem here is this CSS is overriding this CSS. Because if our maximum width is 600, or maximum width is certainly 800, so let's say our width is 400. Well, then this media query is going to be true. It's going to go ahead and set the CSS. But then all of a sudden we said, okay, we've got this 400. Is it less than 800? And the answer is yes. And now we're going to do this one. So in order to support this, we actually need to change the orders of these. Now, for less than 800, this will be true. But if we're less than 600, then this will overrun it. So I'll make this one be float none, so it actually overrides the float right here. So let's save this and resize. So now we can see 100% all the way up to we get to 400, and then we start floating right, we're 80%, and then we get past 800. Again, I'm not saying this is a good choice of a layout. I'm just saying you could see what you can do. So you can have various kind of breaks when things will change. This is also a good way to deal with, for instance, a navbar. Let's look at an example of a navbar. This is CodePen. It's a cloud-based HTML, CSS, JS editor that allows us to test things. So this is some HTML and some CSS with no associated JavaScript that produces this window at the bottom. We can see we have these various navigations that we can use. They don't actually do anything when we click on it. There's nowhere to go, but they could, right? And it's titled responsive. So if we look at the HTML here, we can see we've got a menu. Let's ignore this checkbox for a moment. And then we have an unordered list and then some various list items. So you can see here these hrefs would take us to wherever we want to go. And then the CSS involved has a media query. Let's look at that in a moment. We've got a media query based on whether we're 768 pixels or not. And that is going to make some changes. Let's look at what happens as we resize. And again, we're looking at the bottom here, see what happens. Our menu items are getting closer and closer together. And all of a sudden, when we hit 768, the menu changes. We just get the hamburger icon. As we click on the hamburger icon, it displays these items. Okay. Now, how is it actually happening? We have no JavaScript for this. What's actually happening is when the hamburger menu is being displayed, there's actually a hidden checkbox here. There's a checkbox here that we click on and it selects it or unselects it. And we can then from CSS use CSS selectors based on the state of whether that's checked or unchecked in order to actually display or not display these items. So unchecked, checked, unchecked, checked. The other interesting thing about responsive design here is not this actual example that we're looking at the bottom, but CodePen.io itself. So let's look at the responsive design here. So if we're wide, it shows an HTML pane, a CSS pane, and a JavaScript pane on the top, and then shows our output in the bottom. As we become narrower, though, notice these become narrower and narrower, which makes sense. And then all of a sudden, those are going to just get too narrow to work with. What happens is we have panes for HTML, CSS, and GS, but we can only show one at a time. And then it shows the result on the right-hand side. Then as we get even more narrow, it's going to switch. Here, we're in a vertical layout. Here, it's going to go to a horizontal layout. Because again, we're just going to get too narrow really easily be able to display the code. That is itself a good example of responsive design. These are the things you can do solely with CSS. However, sometimes you don't want to just use CSS. Sometimes you actually want to use your JavaScript, your React, to actually generate different things depending on, again, what the size of the window that you're in is, so that you could be responsive. So although it's possible to do an awful lot with CSS, sometimes it's easier to break down and do that in JavaScript.